Hello, everyone. Welcome to Congress 2012. My name's Nick Cody. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Social Work here at Laurier. I'd like to thank the Congress, delegates, and members of the local community for attending the lecture today. We're delighted to have you here. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Feridun Hamdullapur, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Waterloo, for the partnership opportunity Congress has created between our two institutions. I'd also like to thank the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences for selecting the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University to co-host the Congress this year. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our guest speaker, Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon, for providing the lecture and sharing his expertise with us today. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Graham Carr, President of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Alors, bon après-midi tout le monde. Oui, je suis Graham Carr, président de la Fédération canadienne des sciences humaines. Encore une fois, il me fait très grand plaisir de vous accueillir cet après-midi. J'aimerais signaler, avant de commencer, que la traduction simultanée est assurée pour cette conférence. Si vous en avez besoin des écouteurs, ils sont disponibles à l'extérieur de la salle. What a week it's been for Congress 2012 here in Kitchener-Waterloo, and what a week it's been for the Big Thinking lecture series. A great opportunity for us to discuss pressing issues facing not only our community of social science and humanities scholars in Canada, but the larger Canadian community, Canadian society, and indeed we have, as I'm sure many of you know, touched on a number of issues of global significance. Before going any further, as this is my last opportunity to say it publicly, and I want to say it publicly, how much the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences appreciates and is grateful to the University of Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier University for the extraordinary support that they have provided in allowing us to mount this hugely successful Congress, which has now attracted 7,400 delegates and counting. Absolutely. If you've been at some of the other events, you know we've spent a lot of time talking about partnerships and collaboration. Believe me, this has been a great partnership and collaboration from the bottom up, from the volunteer staff on the ground through the ranks of the academic conveners and the university presidents, and I can't thank them enough for everything they've done for us. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Association for Universities and Colleges of Canada for making community participation possible at this year's Big Thinking events. And we have, in fact, attracted a number of people from the Kitchener-Waterloo region who have been coming, in some cases, to all of the Big Thinking lectures. I also want to thank the Canada Foundation for Innovation for helping to sponsor the speaker series, and acknowledge as well the support that the Federation receives from our friends at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. But we're not done yet, and that's why you're here. We are very pleased and fortunate to conclude this series of Big Thinking lectures with a Big Thinking lecturer right here in Kitchener-Waterloo. Thomas, or Tad Homer-Dixon, as many of you are aware, holds the CIGI Chair of Global Systems at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. He's also the director of the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation and professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development here at the University of Waterloo. Some of you may be familiar with his prize-winning publications, Environment, Society, and Violence, which won the Caldwell Prize of the American Political Science Association, or perhaps The Upside of Down, Catastrophe, Creativity and the Renewal of Civilization, which won the 2006 National Business Award, or The Ingenuity Gap, which won the 2001 Governor General's Nonfiction Award. Today, Tad is here to talk about new tools for understanding a turbulent world, complexity theory, and the social sciences. Please join me in welcoming Tad Homer-Dixon.
Well, I love the entrance. I very rarely get a chance to come on the stage like that, so it's marvelous to be with you today to talk about some issues that are of deep interest to me. In fact, one of the reasons I came to this community, to the University of Waterloo, a few years ago was so I could work on complexity and deepen my understanding of complexity science and complex systems problems. Now, in the process of preparing my presentation, I realized that I should probably do a little bit of expectations management at the beginning of my presentation. This is a staggeringly large subject, and I can do at best a very preliminary overview today, provide you with a bit of a teaser, and if you're interested in understanding this more, I hope that you would continue your investigation of complex systems theory. I'm quite happy to give any one of you a list of readings or point you in directions on particular issues. But in some ways, the title of this presentation should actually have a question mark instead of a colon. New tools for understanding a turbulent world. Complexity science is very new. It really, in many respects, is only a couple of decades, maybe 3 decades old at the outside. And I think it's a bit of a promissory note. I don't think we've determined yet whether these tools that complexity science seems to be introducing actually have the power to allow us to understand some of the bizarre things that seem to be happening in this world. So in terms of expectation management, I'd like to give you an outline of what I plan to do today, and it can be summarized by these 3 questions. Why are current scientific tools inadequate for understanding our world? I'll actually spend most of my presentation today on that question. Then I'll ask and try to answer, can complexity science help? And really, my provisional answer at this point is maybe. I think we still have to see. I'm optimistic, as many people are, but there's still much work to be done, as you'll see. And then finally, if complexity science can help, how might the social sciences use it? And I think that is still quite unclear. Although, again, at the end of the presentation, I want to give you some indications, some short examples of what we're trying to do at the University of Waterloo to exploit complexity science tools to understand social phenomena. Well, why do we need this new body of ideas and research? I would say that in significant part it's because we are living in a world that increasingly exhibits what you could call in the vernacular surprise. Things just seem to come out of the blue. Events that weren't anticipated or we were told by elites and by experts and managers of our world systems were largely impossible, seem to occur with increasing regularity. I don't know if you remember this. It seems like the Dark Ages now, but it was actually only about 2 years ago. This is just 2 minutes before the BP Transocean rig sank in the Gulf of Mexico on April 22nd, 2010. And we were told that this kind of event was virtually impossible. Yet there it happened. It happened in part because as energy scarcity is worsening around the world, especially for conventional oil, we're going to more difficult places to find oil. Drillers are having to go deeper in more hostile natural environments, in this case through deep water and salt beds underneath the ocean floor. To find ultimately smaller pools of lower quality oil, and we have to use much more complex technology as a result, and the technologies sometimes fail, and we get things like this happening. Here's another extraordinary event that's happened within the last couple of years, also in 2010. Unfortunately, compared to what I have on my monitor here, you can't see this all that well. There are a bunch of vertical lines of increasing density as we get to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and then decreasing density as we increase in temperature. This shows the extent of the anomaly of the summer heat wave in Moscow in 2010. For those of you who are familiar with statistics, this is a probability distribution, frequency distribution, and the 2010 heat wave in Moscow was 4 standard deviations away from the mean. The mean established, as you can see there, is the baseline of 1970 to 2000 temperatures. You can see it right at the top. This looks at all the July temperatures in Moscow from 1950 to 2010 and compares the anomalies or the differences from that average temperature, July temperature from 1970 to 2000. And we find that 2010 is way off the chart. The odds of that happening purely randomly are something like 15,000 to 1. I'll come back to that issue in a while, but this had enormous consequences for the world. The heat wave in Russia caused Russia to close its borders to the export of wheat and grains, and that helped drive up food prices around the world and ultimately contributed, by many people's analysis, to the unrest in the Middle East and North Africa that fall. We see the same kind of volatility in lots of different indicators of world economics and trade. Here we have a series of charts of the fluctuation in commodity prices for grains. You can see we've got barley, maize, rice, rapeseed, soy, and wheat. And all I'm trying to communicate with this image is that prices have been extraordinarily volatile in world food markets recently. And then there's the granddaddy of them all in terms of surprises. The 2008 and continuing world financial crisis. I think it's possible we're about to see another chapter in this particular crisis. This is a quotation from Joe Nocera, one of the best economic commentators in the New York Times, written just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the huge investment house that nobody thought could fail or would be allowed to fail by the central bank in the United States. It did fail. And the cascade of events that occurred after that through October 2008 into November had the consequence of virtually bringing world trade to a halt. It's what economists call a sudden stop in an economy. It was an extraordinary event. The magnitude of it can be seen in this chart of national income in the United States. So you see the final dip there in 2010. Something like a $700 to $800 billion loss in national income during that period of time, during the recession. Now, those of you who are quite familiar with statistics would say, hold on here. If you go back to 1940, you've had a lot of inflation. Also, the economy has grown a tremendous amount. You should at least control for those things. So let's take a look. Here, we're looking at percentage change instead of absolute change. And we can see that this final Great Recession here is just about as deep as the worst, which is shortly after the Second World War in the late 1940s that the United States had experienced, and actually longer in duration in terms of the width of the gray bar than just about any other recession that the United States had experienced. Now, it's interesting to look at this. It appears to have been a process of learning how to run the American economy during the 1950s and through the 60s. Some instability induced by the Vietnam War, the inflation associated with the Vietnam War, the oil shocks during the 1970s. This period in the 1990s is called, by many people at the time, is called the Great Moderation. A lot of economists and experts at that point and commentators said, well, we figured it out. We've learned how to run the national economy and the global economy. We have, quote unquote, repealed the business cycle. Well, whoops. Here we had the dot-com implosion right here, and then things seemed to sort of return to normalcy sort of for a while, and then pow, in the late 2000s, 2008, we saw the current crisis, which is, as I say, continuing. So we shouldn't be surprised by surprise in this new world. But that leaves open the question of where these surprises come from. And I suggest that there are three main reasons why we're seeing more of them, more volatility in all of these different facets of global systems and national systems than we've seen before. Interaction of simultaneous stresses, rising human exploitation of natural resources and natural systems, and then finally greater complexity of social, technological, and human ecological systems. Now, I want to make clear that these three phenomena are not causally isolated from each other. They actually influence each other in powerful ways. I'm not going to go into that today, but in case you're wondering, I'm quite aware of the fact that these three things are related to each other. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about each one of them, the first two reasonably quickly, and then more, because this is a talk about complexity, on the last. So let's look at interaction of simultaneous stresses. This is something that is now starting to become recognized as enormously important for the world. You're starting to see language such as cumulative impacts and interactive impacts in public policy circles. Back in 2006, in my book, The Upside Down, I characterized the problem this way, as multiple converging stresses. The little X's there are multiplication signs, indicating that all these individual stresses have a consequence that's more than just the sum of the individual stresses, that they multiply each other's impacts, producing a phenomenon that I would call overload, which you see discussed and theorized about quite frequently in the social sciences, which is where your institutions, your coping capacity within a society or community simply can't deal with the stresses that are being experienced, with the combined effect of these stresses. Well, that seems a bit abstract. Let's look at the ones I actually talked about in The Upside Down. These five, I spent quite a bit of time, in fact, a chapter for each in the book. Again, I'm not going to speak specifically about this, but I've been pleased to see that this kind of idea is now becoming part of the global public policy vernacular. In fact, the 2012 World Economic Forum Global Risks Report, and WEF produces a global risks report every year. They're really quite thoughtful and sophisticated. But the latest one that was released in February this year in Davos showed this kind of connectivity. What you have at the middle there is global governance failure, something roughly equivalent to what I would call overload of global institutions and national institutions as contributors to global governance. And you see some of the factors that I listed before, population growth, greenhouse gas emissions contributing to climate change, energy issues are located here, and significant financial problems, including inequality. This is the simple version of this chart. The complex version looks like that, all right? So people are starting to get it. And when you go online, you can actually unpack the detail of this chart and go inside it. I'd recommend that. I want to emphasize the importance of the recognition of connectivity in these systems and the fact that these things are working interactively, that there are multiplicative effects among these stresses. That's an enormously important recognition by these folks. So that's a little bit about converging multiple stresses. Let's talk a little bit about rising human exploitation of natural resources and systems. I'm only going to talk about one of multiple issues. I could talk about energy, I could talk about rising inequality, I could talk about increasing instability of the global financial system. Instead, I'm going to talk just briefly about climate change. Many of you, or most of you, are probably quite familiar with this issue. Here we're looking at a representation of rising surface temperatures, average surface temperatures on the planet going back to the beginning of the industrial era up to the present day. This period of time from 1960 to the present has seen a very substantial increase, about 0.7 degrees Celsius. And the general consensus, and it's really a strong consensus, well over 90% of climate scientists, is that that increase cannot be understood in the absence of the causal effect of human-released greenhouse gases. Well, there's a more recent interpretation of the consequences of this. It's not just that we're all getting a little bit warmer every year, but more importantly, the incidence of extreme events seems to be increasing. And this has been emphasized in a recent paper by James Hansen, who's the senior climate scientist in NASA. That is going to get a lot of attention. It's about to be published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the critical chart in the paper is this one, and I want to spend a little bit of time explaining it. This is another probability distribution like the one we saw before. And what Hansen and his co-authors have done is looked at the change in the shape and the position of the probability distribution as we've moved from the decade of 1951 to 1961 up to 2001 to 2011. In the background, you see this black line. That is a normal distribution or Gaussian distribution. And this is the mean for 1951 to 1961. And then we have 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations. That's a 3 sigma event. The Moscow event was a 4 sigma event. But you can see that in 1951 to 1961, 3 sigma events were extraordinarily rare in the world on an annual basis. We're occurring somewhere under 0.5% of the territory of the planet in a summer. Here we're looking in particular at June, July, August. But as we've moved up to the present, we've seen a flattening and a shifting to the right of the probability distribution. And now 3 sigma events are significantly more common. Now, I can't underestimate the importance of this. This is at the beginning of the kind of climate change we're going to see. We've seen maybe 0.8 degrees warming since the industrial era. It's generally predicted that we're going to see 2 degrees, 3 degrees, maybe even 4 degrees this century. And we're already seeing a jump in the frequency of 3 sigma events from under 1% to over 10% in frequency. This is what Hansen says. The most dramatic and important change of the climate dice is the appearance of a new category of extreme climate outliers. These extremes were practically absent from 1951 to 1980, covering much less than 1% of Earth's surface. Now summertime, extremely hot outliers, more than 3 standard deviations warmer than that period from 1951 to 1980, typically cover about 10% of the land area. And then he suggests what we're going to see in the future. If global warming is not slowed from its current pace, by mid-century, 3 sigma events will be the new norm, and 5 sigma events will be common. 5 sigma events are currently, or at least according to the odds from 1951 to 1980, are about 1 in a million. So the world is changing very significantly. Let's go on to look at the third of these influences on surprise. Third explanation for the increase in the frequency of surprise: greater complexity of social, technological, and human ecological systems. This is where I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in my talk. And the basic argument that I'm going to make, and many of you will already be pretty comfortable with this, is that we need to shift from seeing the world as composed mainly of machines to seeing it as composed mainly of complex systems. This is what philosophers would call a deep ontological shift, that we have to actually perceive the world and its basic constituents, its basic reality, in a fundamentally different way. When I talk about this with my students, I have a clock like this at home, and I bring it in, and if it's a seminar, I put it in the middle of the table, and I say, look, I can take this thing apart. I can break it into its individual pieces, its springs, its ratchets, screws, and other bits and pieces. And I can look at them all and understand their implications and understand how they fit together. And I can put it back together with a very precise understanding of the internal mechanism. And if it doesn't work properly, and by the way, it means something for one to say that it doesn't work properly, we know what working properly is for a clock. If it doesn't work properly, I can usually attribute the problem to a piece that's broken or missing or bent or something like that. I can have a very reductionist understanding of the machine. So we commonly assume that such simple machines, and they're complicated machines, the human brain is a complicated machine, and even you might say a complex machine, but in our commonplace understanding, we assume that simple machines like clocks can be taken apart, analyzed, and fully understood. They are no more ultimately than the sum of their parts. And that's a really fundamental principle or property. They show, these simple machines, proportionality of cause and effect. Small causes cause small effects, big causes cause big effects. That's what is called linear causation. They exhibit normal or equilibrium patterns of behavior. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And because of these three characteristics and certain others, but principally these three, machines can be managed and their behavior can be predicted, which aids our ability to manage them. And this notion of equilibrium turns out to be critically important, and it's everywhere in the social sciences, especially in economics. You remember in Economics 101, the crossing supply and demand curves, where they cross is an equilibrium point. And the economy, supposedly, or the market naturally gravitates towards that equilibrium point. It's very stable. That's where the world wants to be. It's like a ball in the bottom of a bowl, and you tap the ball or the marble, and it rolls back down to the bottom, and everything is understandable and controllable and stable, ultimately. Well, it turns out that complex systems throw a wrench into that view of the world. They are more, ultimately, than the sum of their parts. They exhibit what philosophers call emergent properties. You put all the bits and pieces together, and the whole thing starts doing things that you couldn't have anticipated just by looking at the bits and pieces. The whole has novel properties. It's a bit like if you put all the pieces of the clock together and put the last screw in, tighten it up, and then when the clock got up on a couple of legs that came out of the bottom and looked at you and said, "Hi, I'm out of here," and just sort of walked out of the room. And you'd look at it and say, "Wow, that's really weird." And that's, I never expected that. That would be an emergent phenomenon. Complex systems show disproportionality of cause and effect. Small causes can sometimes cause big effects. And just as importantly, sometimes really big things within a complex system, a really big event of some kind, don't seem to have much subsequent effect at all. So there's this disproportionality of magnitude between cause and effect. And that is a thing that is called nonlinear behavior. And it's because of certain internal phenomena within complex systems, especially as identified here, feedbacks, positive self-reinforcing feedbacks, and negative self-canceling or self-equilibrating feedbacks within these systems. Loops, basically, causal loops of various kinds, as well as the kind of interactions or synergies or multiplicative effects that I was talking about before when I was talking about those multiplication signs. You get those kinds of interactions all the time in complex systems. You combine the interactions together with feedbacks, and you start to see dramatically nonlinear behavior. And complex systems can flip from one pattern of behavior to another. They have, critically, not a single equilibrium where they like to be, they have multiple equilibria. And often it's very difficult to determine which place they're going to be in, or when they might shift from one equilibrium to another. Now, as a result of these three characteristics, complex systems cannot be easily managed because their behavior is often highly unpredictable. Just a little bit more on multiple equilibriums. It's as if the landscape looked like this. Rather than a single bowl, you have a series of dips, and if the perturbation is strong enough, you can knock that marble out of the bowl and into another dip, and you really don't often know in advance how big the perturbation has to be, or what the world might be like in one of those other equilibria positions. So let me spend a little bit of time talking then about what's causing our economies and societies to become more complex, and a little bit then about the consequences of this increase in complexity. Now, you can tell a big story here, of course, and I'm distilling this down into a few very simple points. I would say that fundamentally over the last 30 or 40 years or so, We've seen extraordinary advances in information technology, perhaps 100 million-fold or greater increase in the ability to communicate information between individuals or entities within our economies and societies. And in part because of improvements in information technology and also other improvements in performance, we've seen huge improvements in performance at the level of individuals, organizations, and corporations and technologies. IT is an important part of that improvement in productivity or performance, but it's not the only part. So these changes, in turn, improvements in information technology and improvements in performance in technologies, in corporations and individuals and firms and the like, contribute to these three characteristics: more nodes, a greater density of connections among nodes. And by nodes, I mean in our economic and social networks. I mean things like individuals, organizations, communities, perhaps whole countries, individual technologies such as the desktop computer sitting on your desk at home. And in turn, we've seen faster movement of material, energy, and information along these increasingly dense connections. So you're getting more connections, similar to the proliferation of connections that the World Economic Forum identified in that chart that I showed you before. And you're getting faster movement of stuff along those connections, and that has tightened the coupling in the system. A bit like everybody, instead of moving down a highway with lots of space, moving down the highway at high speed, say 120, 140 kilometers an hour, instead of all being spaced out so that they can compensate if there's a surprise, somebody hits the brakes suddenly because a deer goes across the road or something like that. Instead, everybody is suddenly bumper to bumper and tailgating. And the result is that you have very little buffering capacity to deal with any kind of surprise, like a deer running across the road. And if there's an accident of some kind, it tends to cascade and affect a much larger part of the system, i.e., in this particular system, more cars. You have a multi-car accident as a result. So just a little illustration. These nodes, as I say, can be technologies, corporations, individuals, more nodes, more connections, more links between them, and faster movement of stuff along those links. Now, that complexity that has emerged, and it is an emergent phenomenon, is not necessarily a bad thing. And folks who say that I have some kind of axe to grind about complexity are simply wrong. There's a reason we introduce complexity. Often we do it deliberately, and we do it to solve our problems. It can be a source, as I indicate here, of innovation because it allows for more novel combinations between ideas and technologies and procedures. When you connect a lot of stuff together, you have interactions that weren't available before, and that tends to be the deep source of innovation in our economies and societies. And equivalently, it increases our ability to adapt to changes in our natural environment, which is why, for instance, the most highly adaptive ecosystems tend to be very complex ecosystems because they have diverse and distributed problem solving at the level of individual organisms and species, because there are a lot of different ways of solving problems within a complex ecology. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing. And sometimes when I do this presentation, I talk at some length about each of these issues. I won't today. I'll say just a little bit about each, though. Complexity can cause opaqueness. A number of times I've talked to policymakers and they say repeatedly, I just don't understand what's going on. There was an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago saying that, the heads not only of the banks, some of the major banks like Chase in the United States, Bank of America, don't understand what's going on with their derivatives transactions. But even the traders don't really completely understand the new assets and derivatives they've created and the consequences of various kinds of interconnections within the market when those derivatives are traded. So the system becomes increasingly opaque. This is a little anecdote. I first understood machines by taking apart a Rocket 88 V8 engine in my Oldsmobile, 1952 Oldsmobile, when I was a kid back in the early 1970s. I broke the thing down and understood. It was very much like the clock, right? Now, when I look at the engine of my Subaru Forester, 2012 Subaru Forester, I can't make head or tail of it. right? All those of you who may have cut your teeth on simpler engines and worked on them in your garage will probably find that for the most part, there are a lot of things you can't do with a modern engine, and it's become opaque. Even the repair person in the local shop, if something's wrong with your car engine, they'll run the scope on it and all the electronic stuff, and they'll figure out what the component is wrong, and they'll pop the component out, the whole component, and ship it off somewhere else and put a new component in. They don't fix it. They just replace a big part that is understood only by specialists elsewhere in the system. Now, this opaqueness can be a real challenge when it comes to, again, managing and understanding systems. Complexity can cause extreme events and system flips in the way that I've already described. It can cause managerial overload, especially when you have a whole bunch of things happening simultaneously, those multiple stresses, interacting stresses I was talking about before. And finally, complexity can cause brittleness. Under some circumstances, especially when you've got a lot of tight coupling in a system, just like on that highway with the cars traveling too close together, you have a shock and it proliferates like a row of falling dominoes all falling over. It cascades through the entire system. The SARS outbreak started in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and within a week it was in Toronto and shut down our medical system in Toronto. The financial crisis started in a relatively small part of the global economy, big economy, the United States economy, but the subprime housing market in the United States economy, really a tiny part of the global economy. But within a relatively short period of time, about a year or so from the beginning of that crisis in the subprime housing market up to the time of the Lehman collapse, and then beyond that Lehman collapse, we had a cascading effect that caused every single economy in the world to go into recession simultaneously. The first time since the Great Depression that had happened. Now that is a brittle system. It's not a resilient system, which is what you would like to have, one that can bounce back or recover or adapt quickly to crisis and shock rather than breaking down so substantially. So in many respects, we're moving from a world of risk to a world of uncertainty. And this is a distinction that goes back to the 1920s. It was originally made in the 1920s, but it's been resurrected over the last little while, especially in trying to understand this latest financial crisis. In a world of risk, you can have some sense for what pathways a particular system you're interested in might develop along in the future. And along a given pathway, you have enough evidence to be able to estimate the potential costs and benefits to oneself or to the firm or the society you're interested in, the potential costs and benefits of going down that pathway. That's a world of risk. In a world of uncertainty, you don't have enough information to estimate the pathways or the costs and benefits of going along those pathways. You're actually in a world of unknown unknowns. You're ignorant of your own ignorance. You don't even know what questions to ask, fundamentally. And that is a very different world for public policymakers. And it's a very different world for social scientists, too. It's one, frankly, that most of us don't want to inhabit because we derive a lot of our influence and our wealth and power as intellectuals and academics within our societies from the supposition that we can provide knowledge that will actually help decision makers manage these complex systems better. But if they're actually full of unknown unknowns and are highly complex, then we probably aren't able to provide a lot of that kind of knowledge. So can complexity science help with this challenge? I want to spend a few minutes, the last part of my talk, talking about complexity science and specifically about how the social sciences might exploit complexity science. I mentioned at the beginning that complexity science is a relatively new field. In some respects, it goes back to shortly after the Second World War. You can trace its roots, but it really began to develop in the 1970s and the 80s. You've probably heard of, for instance, catastrophe theory, which was introduced in particular by René Thom in the 1960s and 70s. Came out of mathematics. So the roots of complexity science really originate in physics and mathematics, and then computer science and information theory, and more recently, interestingly enough, ecology, because ecologists deal with intrinsically complex systems. Some of the most interesting work has been published by Martin Scheffer in the Netherlands, and he has looked at, he's a limnologist, specialist in freshwater lakes, and he's looked at the phenomena that lead lakes to flip from a clear state to a turbid state, to a murky state, depending on the concentration of nutrients in those lakes. And this is one of the few places where a complex system has been really fully characterized and understood. Here's a simplified causal map of this phenomenon of flip from a clear to a turbid state. Now, Martin's work, of course, produces much more sophisticated causal elaboration than this, but this is a simplified version. It can show you some of the critical positive and negative causal relationships. Positive, the plus sign means that the two things vary simultaneously or in the same direction. Sediment increases, turbidity increases, for example, on the top left. A negative sign indicates that they vary in opposite directions. More fish lead to less zooplankton. Well, it turns out that when you put all this model together, you get some very interesting behavior, including nonlinear behavior. And again, I could talk a great deal about this, but this work has influenced my work significantly, as you'll see in a moment. Basically, what we see here is that as nutrients increase in a lake, if the lake has healthy vegetation, as nutrients increase, vegetation increasingly gets stressed. And then at some point you get to this, and when you get to this level of nutrients, you get a flip in the lake, and the vegetation dies, and turbidity increases dramatically. So you jump from one spot to another here. And that's the nonlinearity, that's the system flip from one equilibrium to another. And if you want to get back to this line with the vegetation, to a healthy, clear lake with vegetation, you actually have to reduce the nutrient concentration much more than the level that got you to this state in the first place. You have to come all the way back here, and then you flip back to a state with vegetation. That's called, by complexity theorist, hysteresis. You can't come back the same route that brought you to where you are. If you are here, if you flipped over here, you can't come back this direction. You actually have to go down here before you come back to a state with vegetation. And Martin has done a beautiful job of characterizing how this behavior works. And he's also developed, along with a number of other scientists, a set of tools for anticipating when this kind of flip will occur, looking at statistical signals in the behavior of certain characteristics of the lake that tell you that a flip is approaching, that you're about to shift from one state to another. And a number of folks are investigating whether those statistical characteristics can be used to anticipate things like climate flips or flips in the global economy, whether you can see the same advance indicators in the statistical behavior of the climate or the financial system to suggest that you're about to go off a cliff. You can imagine that would be of huge importance to policymakers. Well, social scientists are certainly becoming more familiar with the implications of complexity. They're starting to understand the implications of complexity, but very few, I would argue, are well-versed in complexity science or in its tools. And in the next 3 slides, I'm just going to give you an indication of some research that we've done that shows you what a long way we have to go, which is why I think we need the question mark at the end of my title rather than the colon. Now, these particular charts were prepared by a co-author with me, Matto Mildenberger, who's currently a PhD student at Yale University. And what Matto did, and what we've been doing together, is we've been going back and looking at some literature in international relations theory, where there's been an explicit attempt to take complex systems ideas and apply them to international behavior. So now we're solidly in the social sciences. And we've taken half a dozen of the main and representative efforts to apply complex systems thinking to the international system. And you would think that the international system is an exemplary complex system, and it is. So some people have tried to take these concepts and use them. And what we've done is we've prepared a concept map from these articles of how people are thinking about complexity in each case. And I'm just going to show you 3 of them. So this is the first one, and it may be hard for you to see. I realize that some of this is very small. This is Rosenau's classic book, Turbulence, in 1990. Now, this was one of the first efforts to characterize the international system in terms of complexity. And what I want you to get from these 3 diagrams is not anything about the contents, but just the fact that there's complete incoherence across these various stories that these theorists are telling. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of accumulation. I don't think we're clearly getting better. Now here, in this particular view of things, Rosenau does talk about complexity, but he doesn't include concepts like feedback or nonlinearity or emergence, which are really fundamental to thinking about complexity. But again, it was the first attempt, and you can give him a break because of that. More recently, though, a very well-known book by Robert Jervis called System Effects in 1998, now we're starting to see concepts like positive feedback and nonlinearity and emergence. But here we have emergence as a causal source of nonlinearity. Positive feedbacks are also a source of nonlinearity. But emergence, rather than being a consequence of something like feedback, which I think is the right way of thinking about it, is a cause itself. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of cohesion and organization to Jervis's way of thinking about complexity. And come up to something closer to the present. This is one of the best current pieces on complexity by Harrison, Complexity in World Politics in 2007. Now here we have a situation where emergence is rightfully the consequence of all of these phenomena, but positive feedbacks don't have any influence on complexity at all. In fact, his definition of complexity has nothing to do with positive feedbacks. But both complexity and positive feedbacks contribute to unpredictability and uncertainty. The point I'm making simply is that we have a long way to go in the social sciences to tell a coherent story about the deep ontology of complex systems that would be useful for the social sciences. So how might social scientists use complexity science? That was the last question, and in my last few minutes, I'm just going to say a little bit about that. I think that there are many ways we can use it. I'm highlighting 3 here: conceptualization, representation, and experimentation. And I'm going to use as examples some of the work that we've been doing in the Waterloo Institute for Complexity and Innovation, WICI, or Wiki. And if you're interested in this work, you can go to our website, www.wiki.ca. I'll just give you 3 examples, one for each of those categories. First, in terms of conceptualization, thinking about nonlinear behavior. This is some work that I've been doing over the last year or so, thinking about, in particular, the nonlinear phenomenon of dehumanization in extreme conflict, where you flip from a situation where one flips. Think about road rage. Most of you have experienced that at one point or another, probably, where you flip from a situation of being able to identify with another person to a situation where you've lost all possibility of identification, and quite possibly as a consequence, if necessary, if you were mortally endangered, you could attack that person and kill them. There may be some evolutionary fitness reason for the development of this capacity to shut off our ability to identify and empathize, and it does seem to be a bit like a switch that's flipped, that you go from one state to another. And what I've tried to do in this model, and this is working with some of Martin Scheffer's ideas, is I've tried to characterize this nonlinear behavior of dehumanization in a 3-dimensional space with 3 variables: justice, structural constraint, which consists of the perception of a particular individual of their constraint on their agency, their latitude or elbow room for doing things, and also others within the system or the population. And then identity, the strength of the perception of we-ness, from highly inclusive on this axis to exclusive and antagonistic. I'm not going to go through this in detail, But the point is that this surface, which is called a catastrophe cusp or a response surface, represents the set of all possible psychological states of combinations of those three variables. And when you have a perception, I would argue, on the part of an individual that there is a lot of latitude for agency, that people have the capacity to do a lot of things. They're not controlled by institutions or by power relations, police forces, for example, that there is, say, for instance, anarchy in the system. When you have that perception, so you're at this front plane of this cube, out here, weak structural constraint, that as justice declines, you drop off this cusp. You have the capacity to drop off this cusp and have a sudden change in your identification with the other. You flip from one state to another very easily in those circumstances. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but it gives you a sense for how we can use some of these tools to think in really interesting ways about phenomena that have real consequence for the world. Two others, quickly. We can use some recent thinking within complex systems theory to better represent the states of mind and belief systems of individuals who are engaged, for instance, in conflict or complex negotiations. This is something that we are pioneering here within Wiki at the University of Waterloo. And in particular, we're using these maps called cognitive affective maps, which are like concept maps, but each of the concepts in the map has an emotional loading, as indicated. If you've got a green oval, it's emotionally positive, a red hexagon, emotionally negative, etc. And it turns out you can use these to represent extremely complex belief systems in ways that tell you an enormous amount about the nature of a particular person's view of the world. In this case, this one's put together by Manjana Milkarite, one of my PhD students who's looking at climate negotiators. This is a participant in the Durban Climate Conference. You can see in the middle, if you're able to see that, there's climate change. And there are clusters of positive, and here in this case, negative elements that influence perceptions of climate change. And the interesting thing about this is based on the work of Paul Thagard at the University of Waterloo, is that you can study the consequences of a change in one element, some from, say, emotionally negative to emotionally positive, or the removal of an element, or the removal of a link, and you can study, with this kind of technology, the consequences for the entire belief system as that change cascades across the entire network. You can use this for conflict resolution and negotiation. You could represent the points of view of different actors and identify possibilities for resolution that might not have been recognized otherwise. And then finally, in terms of experimentation, one of the principal tools that's available to complexity scientists is agent-based modeling. And in this case, what you do is you create a computer simulation, a computer environment with a lot of agents. You can think of them like people. Each of these little dots here might be an agent in a virtual reality or virtual space, and each one of these dots has a little computer program that tells it how it's supposed to behave depending on what's happening in its environment. You can build into that agent something like a cognitive affective map. We're working on a system where those cognitive affective maps evolve as the agents interact over time. And you can understand, or you can experiment with potentially very complex sets of factors to try to identify what can happen over time in a population. And you can see things like bifurcations and system flips from one equilibrium to another. And Don Parker at the University of Waterloo, in planning at the University of Waterloo, has been using this technology to understand land development patterns in suburban regions in the United States and urban regions, and in particular to track how different kinds of regulatory environments can affect things like the carbon output of different patterns of urbanization. Well, that brings me to the end. I just want to say one last thing about why this grabs me and why it's important. On the left here, a photograph of my two children, Kate, who's now 4, and Ben, who's 7 years old. This is shot's a couple of years old. And on the right, we have a map of what the planet is likely to look like under a anticipated, quite likely climate scenario by the year 2080 or so, about the end of Kate and Ben's lifetime, where we're seeing those red areas have a 90 to 100% chance that any given summer in 2080 will be warmer than the warmest summer on record to date. That's the world that our children are growing into. There is an urgent need for new tools. Now, I don't know exactly where they're going to come from, but I feel reasonably confident after the work I've done in complex systems theory that at least some of them are going to emerge from this field. And I would strongly encourage you to think about how they might be used within your own fields of investigation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for questions. Si vous voulez poser des questions, veuillez utiliser les micros à chaque côté de la salle. We already have questioners, so I'll resist asking the obvious question, whatever happened to the 1952 Rocket 88, and instead we'll go straight to the microphone.
Well, I can say I rebuilt the engine and restored a lot of the car, and then I got distracted by other interests, and it sat in the garage for a long time. It was eventually sold. But it was I explained this in the ingenuity gap. It was a very critical part of my development and understanding of causation. And I'm sure most people in the audience have had a similar experience at some point, where you have this sudden epiphany where you understand that once you put these pieces together, they have a certain consequence. But it was a particular notion of causation. It wasn't a complex systems notion of causation.
Okay, let's go to the microphone over here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I noticed in your causes of increased surprise that we're experiencing today, you didn't have our notion of human exceptionalism on your charts, or the idea that we can, in fact, fit the world in our head and explain everything. One of the things that I've learned about super wicked problems is, well, I've read that those who are trying to solve them are also causing them. And some may argue that this notion of human exceptionalism is part of the positivist project that's created some of these super wicked problems, such as climate change. So my question for you is why? Why use complexity theory? Because it seems very much to me, and this is my fear, as is always the case in the social sciences, we get mystified by science because it's not our background. Why would we want to use this? Because it feels very much as if it's pushing forward the positivist project of continuing to think that we can fit the whole world inside our head just by coming up with more complex models.
Well, no, I don't think so. So I'm glad you asked that question. It's an important question, but I think it exhibits a misunderstanding of complex systems theory. I think what emerges because of the deep uncertainty, the unknown unknowns that are intrinsic to complex systems, what emerges is a recognition of a plurality of possibilities. And that actually opens up space for a more diverse and plural normative conversation than would be available within a conventional scientific ontology. Now, I think that the danger is actually the opposite danger, that we're going to, some people will take a look at complex systems theory and say, well, we can't manage and we can't predict, so let's jettison science altogether. And I think that is a much greater risk than this enterprise being used to further the narrow positivist agenda, which, by the way, I wouldn't reject entirely. I mean, there's certain things like building bridges. I'm glad that we have very good specific understandings of the causal laws, Newtonian in many respects, that allow us to do that work effectively. We can get into a debate about whether those laws represent truth or not. I have an entirely pragmatic point of view on these things and shy away from those questions of truth, as frankly most positivists, real positivists do too. But we don't want to reject it. We don't want to reject science. And I think what complex systems theory does, as I was suggesting with the example from Martin Scheffer, is that it may provide us a different set of tools. First of all, it probably encourages us to be more prudent in our interactions with the world because we don't know where the cliff edges are. But we may also develop certain tools for anticipating in a very rough and ready sense where some of the changes might occur, some of the things that could be particularly dangerous for us. So we have a sense for where we would like to be in this multidimensional state space and where we don't want to be, but we don't know exactly where the boundaries are. It's a much more ambiguous science, ultimately, in terms of its consequences, and I don't think that reinforces the positivist program at all.
Okay, let's move to the other side of the room. Question?
Hello, it's been a great pleasure for me. Oh, my name is Bruce Alexander. It's been a great pleasure for me to hear you talk, Dr. Homer-Dixon, and also to hear Chris Hedges talk in the same day, because you are two of my favorite authors. But
I'm deeply flattered.
well, but there's a huge, I mean, there are many similarities, of course, in the problems that you're addressing, but there's a huge difference in the sense that he is saying that the problems are fundamentally political, fundamentally because we've been wedded to a particular kind of political thought that must change. And you're saying that politics is not part of your speech.
No, actually, I'm glad you raised this, because I want to be clear. I couldn't go into detail, but if you took a close look at that cognitive effective map of that climate change negotiation participant, it's full of politics. It's about power and interpretations of power. And by the way, I should say that in that model of catastrophic dehumanization, this variable structural constraint is really fundamentally a political variable. It's about the application of power.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it quite as strongly as I did. But you may know that he ended his speech by saying we academics must get out of the academy. We must be on the streets, on the police lines. And you're really saying, in effect, that we must turn to complexity theory. I like your view much better, because I don't welcome the idea of throwing myself in front of tanks or being arrested or any of that. But I do see a difference, even though, as you say, there's a political content to what you said. There's not the political centrality that I hear in his, as it's addressed to me.
Well, in a very short presentation, I couldn't elaborate on everything we're trying to do. So this work that we're doing in our Cognitive Effective Map project, which is called CAM, C-A-M, for Cognitive Effective Map, and then / Structure of Ideology program, research program, is we're trying to get a much better understanding of the belief systems that seem to be implicated in, for instance, the lack of progress on the climate change issue, right? Which has become climate change has become an ideologically polarizing issue in a very profound way, especially in the United States. And that ideological divide has been exploited politically by certain actors in order to prevent any kind of policy on climate change in very effective ways. I happen to agree, and by the way, James Hansen, whose work I was using here, has become an advocate of mobilization and political action. I happen to agree that that kind of mobilization is now critically important for addressing some of these problems. So I would think we actually should be in front of the tanks. But I think it needs to be informed by this kind of research. So we have a much more fine-grained understanding of the topology of the belief landscape that we're in. If I have a minute, I'll just tell you what we're up to, okay? You can think of ideology as any particular ideology as existing within a multidimensional state space, similar to that three-dimensional cube I showed. Each axis is a dimension that can be characterized as a question that an ideology would ask. So an ideology would answer, I should say, not ask. So an ideology might have a particular orientation towards the past or the future. It might have a particular orientation towards change or no change, towards determinism or free will. Most ideologies take a place somewhere on those issues. And there are about a dozen or 13 of these questions or dimensions, and you can sort of think of a dozen or 13 dimension state space. Within that state space, you probably have equilibria or basins of attraction. These are places where the answers to the questions are more or less coherent, and people like to cluster in those places. Now, there's a good psychological reason to believe that societies and individuals will take 2 or 3 of those things and will cycle, or will lock themselves into left and right, for example, maybe 3 positions at the most. And this is an enormous possibility space, And there may be many other ways of looking at the world that we don't even see. We're not aware of them being there in the absence of this kind of analysis. And even if we do find out they're there, we don't have any adequate understanding of how to migrate from one place in that state space to another. Now, I think that's an enormously emancipating possibility, emancipating idea. It's about deep change in our beliefs and values that could allow us to live on this planet in fundamentally different ways, rather than get ourselves locked into these very narrow belief systems and ideological disputes that we seem to be in right now. Now that, to me, is a profoundly political project.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we may not get to all the questions, but I just want to let people know that Tad will be signing books in the lobby after the talk, so those of you who don't have an opportunity to ask a question from the microphone, you'll have a chance to talk to him there. But over to this microphone.
Hello, my name's Adam Goodwin. I'm from the University of Ottawa. I'm also a student of complexity theory. I guess I have to take issue, if you'll forgive me, I may have misunderstood your argument in some way. I have to take issue with the idea of placing, and I looked at your chart, energy flows as necessarily a dependent variable on complexity. I view energy as an independent variable. I view complexity as a fight against entropy, against the second law of thermodynamics. I think centralized human social organization is undeniably a complex mechanism or a complex system, but it is forever fighting the inevitable tendency for things to decay and to dissolve over time. Further to that point, I think that the uncertainty that we often hear being kind of the claim of uncertainty being leveled at this time is really has found an origin in the peak oil literature that goes back to the late 90s, where peak oil people like Richard Heinberg, James Kunstler, and so on, looked at energy inputs as when they go into decline, civilization will also suffer because of that. And we saw recently in Nature in 2012, January issue of Nature, we see that oil is plateaued. Production is plateaued, or production, I should say in quotes, extraction is plateaued since 2005, right? Then we see, you could say we get fracking and the tar sands in North America, but they are subsidized operations. If you look at it in terms of thermodynamics, energy return on energy invested, these are subsidized operations by OPEC oil, right? So we are now entering a permanent decline of the most crucial fuel, transport fuel, which is unsubstitutable so far. And what effects that will have on the globalized economy. And as an additional point, I don't understand.
Can we get to a question,
Yeah,
though?
the question is why, if complex systems are very sensitive to initial conditions, and we have an initial condition that perpetual growth is necessary for life to exist. Nothing in biology demonstrates perpetual growth, infinite growth. It's not possible. But we live under that current paradigm right now where we can assume that we can grow forever, but yet we are also having our energy on the other side of the equation curtailed relentlessly. So perhaps the goggles, the paradigmatic goggles of growth is what's at fault here. Very simple solution.
Can I just maybe interrupt you? And have you got enough to work with for an answer?
Oh, yeah, but first of all, he and I are on exactly the same page. Secondly, I guess you aren't very familiar with my writings, because I've written an enormous amount about peak oil, and in The Upside of Down, chapter 2 is all about the relationship between energy and complexity, and it's a thermodynamic argument. Chapter 4 is about peak oil, and chapter 8 is about the growth imperative. It's all there. Chapter 10 applies Joe Tainter's arguments about complexity and collapse of complex societies, and does an integration using thermodynamics of Joe Tainter's arguments and Buzz Holling's ecological arguments from Panarchy. So it's all there. And I just say that when I was preparing this presentation, given the time constraints, I looked at the slide that talked about thermodynamic openness, and I took it out, because that would have taken an extra 5 minutes to walk through. But just for the rest of the audience, a fundamental characteristic of all complex systems is they require enormous inputs of high-quality energy, and they are far from thermodynamic equilibrium, which means that in energy terms, they are not They are in what you might call a dynamic equilibrium. They're constantly searching for energy to maintain their internal complexity. And by the way, in the Upside of Down, I use the example of the Roman Empire. I walk through the energy consumption of the Roman Empire and do a long calculation of how much energy it took to build the Colosseum, for example, and to fuel the city of Rome. So we're exactly on the same page. And one of the major stresses, just finally, of those converging stresses, I did mention energy scarcity there, one of the major stresses that humankind faces is sustaining sufficient energy input this century to maintain the complexity of technologies and institutions that we want to sustain. You know, we have probably too much complexity in some areas, and we could give some of it up. But for instance, if we want to manage our global climate problem, we're going to need a lot of technological and institutional complexity, and we're going to need energy to do that. And our energy challenge is absolutely fundamental. Last point, I did a whole lecture on this at the Perimeter Institute last summer, which is available online through TVO.
Okay, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of time here, so I'm going to have to cut off the questions from the microphones. As I said, though, you'll have an opportunity to speak to Tad outside. This is a great way to finish the Big Thinking lecture series, because I know one of the criticisms that's often made of academic work is that it's too theoretical and it doesn't have a broad application. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to explore what theory, in this case complex theory, can contribute to our understanding not only of natural phenomena, the natural environment, but of human thought and behavior, which is fundamental to the work that we do as humanities and social science scholars. So, Tad, thank you. And
Good. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tad for